Well, welcome to the vlog today. We're going to talk about the power gained from removing weight from your dirt bike. Before I do that, a couple of things here. This is a regular dirt bike front brake, and I ordered a universal one. Look at this thing. It's a monster. It's like for Bigfoot. Look at that thing. It's a monster. Must be for a street bike or something. Yeah, it ended up being a monster of a cable. I didn't expect it to be that big. But, yeah, so that's some brand new universal. It's huge. So, and one update on this engine here that I'm building. We'll have another video out sometime, but as you can see right there, it is not lining up, so I can't get the bolt through. And part of it is because it's sitting on that bottom frame rail there. So I'm going to cut that frame rail out and see if I can get it get in place there. So yeah, I'm still modifying the frame on this thing to get it to work. So anyhow, we're going to talk about power, or gaining power whenever you remove weight from your bike. So the amount of weight your bike moves is its own weight plus you with full gear and all your tools. Removing weight either from the bike, from your tools, or from yourself allows for the bike to accelerate faster, since it can contribute more power per pound or kilogram than before. So let's give a simple example here. So let's say that you have a cinder block that's sitting on the ground. Now I ask you to pick it up as fast as you can and throw it as far as you can. You can do it. You pick up a cinder block and you throw it, but you're going to be slow and it's not going to go very far. Now I give you a smaller rock, and this rock fits in your hand. You're able to pick this rock up much faster, and you can throw it much farther. Yet you're using the same amount of power, which is you. I mean, it's not like you gained power or lost power in between, but you're able to attribute more of your own power per the weight of the rock than you were in the cinder block. And so you're able to throw it much, much farther. This is essentially the same concept as the bike. And so you can figure out how much more horsepower you would need to throw that cinder block in the same manner. Now, if you and that's what the gain is. So if you figure out how much power you would have needed to throw the cinder block the same amount as you did the small rock, that's how much power you technically gained in throwing the small rock. The first thing I want to talk about is the power to weight ratio. This is the power divided by the weight. It gives you a ratio. And this ratio is how much power is distributed to each pound or kilogram of weight. So for 1 pound or 1 kilogram, depending on what your weight is in, this is how much power is dedicated, how much horsepower is dedicated to move that amount of weight. The weight to power ratio is the opposite. It's the weight divided by the power gives you a ratio. And this is how much weight is distributed to 1 horsepower. So every 1 horsepower, this is how much weight that 1 horsepower has to move. So the goal is then to determine how much power was gained from the weight loss. And you can use one of 2 sets of equations. You can use the power to weight ratio, or you can use the weight to power ratio. The only difference is you use either the top 2 equations, or you use the bottom 2 equations. And we're going to go over using the top 2 equations. But it would be the same to use the bottom equations. So the bike weighs 240 pounds. You weigh 220. So the total weight of 460. So now let's figure out the power to weight ratio and the weight to power ratio for this number here. Now one thing we have to take in mind, though, is that let's say your bike makes 50 horsepower at peak RPM. So your bike, that doesn't mean that your bike is flat. It doesn't mean that off of idle you make 50 horsepower. Your bike makes varying horsepower across the entire RPM range. So, for example, at just off of idle at maybe 4,000 RPM, you perhaps make 20 horsepower. At 6,000 RPM, perhaps you make 30 horsepower. And then let's say that at peak RPM, which is 9,000 RPM, you make 50 horsepower. And so let's do that, and let's calculate the values based on that and see where we end up. So this is the power to weight ratio. We take 20 horsepower, divide by 460, and we get 0.0435 horsepower used per pound. And then we get 30 horsepower divided by 460, and we get 0.0652 horsepower used per pound. And 50 horsepower divided by 460 is 0.109 horsepower used per pound. And if we went to kilograms, we can do 50 divided by 209 kilograms, and we get 0.239 horsepower per kilogram. And if we divide that by 2.205, that's the conversion from kilogram to pounds. We end up with how many pounds, or how many horsepower per pound, which is exactly the same as the above equation. And I did that to just show you that it doesn't really matter what numbers you use, because it's all about what the numbers represent. And so in this case, it represents pounds or kilograms. So you're going to get slightly different numbers. But as I show, even though they're different, they're the same because you can convert them back and forth. Some people may find the opposite easier to visualize. If you take the weight divided by the horsepower, you get how many pounds per 1 horsepower. So in this case, at 20 horsepower, 23 pounds is being moved by 1 horsepower. At 30 horsepower, you're getting 15.33 pounds being moved per horsepower. And of course, as you increase the amount of horsepower you have, the less pounds is attributed to a single horsepower. And in the last case, it's 9.2. Alright, so let's say that you lost 20 pounds, or basically 9 kilograms. Actually, it's 9.5 kilograms, but I'm just using round numbers here. So, let's say you lost 20 pounds. Either you lost it, you took it off the bike, you took some gear off, you bought some lighter gear, or a combination of things. You lost some weight, you took some things off the bike, and you switched out tools and bought lighter gear, something like that. So you lost 20 pounds. So here's what the difference looks like. I'm not going to go through everything, but as you can see at different RPM ranges, you actually are using, this is weight to power ratio. So this is how much weight, how many pounds is attributed to a single horsepower. So for example, at 20 horsepower, you're using 1 less pound per horsepower. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to look at the power to weight ratios here. So this is how much horsepower is attributed to a single pound. Now, we're going to now use this equation here to convert into how much horsepower is equivalent to move 460 pounds. So to get this ratio. And that's how much horsepower we technically gained. And so, let's figure that out for the first one now. So, in this case, we take the ratio, we multiply it by 460, and we get 20.93 horsepower. So technically, we gained almost a full horsepower by dropping 20 pounds. At 30 horsepower, we gained more than 1 horsepower. We gained 1.3 horsepower just by dropping 20 pounds. And finally, at 50 horsepower, we gained 2.5 horsepower. So throughout the entire RPM range, we've gained horsepower. We've gained incremental amounts of horsepower as we go through the RPM range. So definitely you would notice that difference. Again, it's not that you actually physically are now at 52 horsepower, obviously. It is just that the equivalent of moving the weight per previously, to get the same amount of gain, you would have had to have had 52 horsepower to remove the previous weight. So you end up with what feels like a gain of horsepower when you're just using the horsepower more efficiently. And so you freed up more horsepower per pound or kilogram. So, and one last thing is that the units don't matter. So this is an example here of kilograms versus the pounds that I use. Now you'll see that I have different numbers here, and these are still aren't that accurate, but what I did in the previous is I rounded up the numbers. So by rounding up the numbers, you look like a little bit more of a gain by 0.2 horsepower than it really was. So whenever you use the accurate numbers, or these are still rounded, but using the accurate numbers that are all conversion, you actually end up with the equal. These are still a little bit off because I still rounded them to a smaller decimal points, but you get the same answer. It doesn't really matter if you're using pounds or kilograms.